How food preservation changed civilization. Imagine you are standing in a field 10,000 years ago. You have just harvested more grain than your village can eat in a week. Without some way to store that surplus, it rots. Your community stays small, stays mobile, stays vulnerable. But what if you could make that grain last for months? What if you could store enough food to feed people who never had to farm? What if preservation itself was the secret ingredient that built every city, every empire, every civilization you have ever studied? That is exactly what happened. Food preservation is not a cooking technique. It is the foundation of human history. Background: the problem that shaped everything before preservation. Human beings were at the complete mercy of the seasons. Hunter-gatherer groups followed food sources across landscapes, never settling long enough to build permanent structures, establish complex governments, or develop specialized trades. The reason was brutally simple. Fresh food spoils. A successful hunt fed a group for days, not months. A berry harvest was gone as quickly as it arrived. The human relationship with food was entirely reactive, not strategic. Then something shifted, and it shifted in multiple places around the world at roughly similar times. Around 10,000 BCE, communities in the Fertile Crescent, in the Yellow River Valley, and in Mesoamerica all began experimenting with ways to make food last longer. Drying, salting, fermenting, smoking, these were not accidental discoveries. They were hard-won solutions to an existential problem. And each solution they found unlocked a new layer of social complexity that would have been impossible without it. The earliest confirmed food storage sites archaeologists have discovered date to around 9000 BCE in the Jordan Valley region. Ancient stone storage pits, carefully lined and sealed, held wild grain long past its natural expiration. This is not a minor footnote in history. This is the moment the clock started ticking on everything we call civilization. Main content: the Big Four methods and their world-changing impact. Drying and dehydration. The oldest and most universal method of food preservation is simple dehydration. Remove the moisture, remove the environment bacteria need to thrive. Ancient Egyptians dried fish and grains in the desert sun. Indigenous communities across North America created pemmican by drying meat and mixing it with fat, producing a calorie-dense food that could survive months without refrigeration. Pemmican became so reliable and efficient that it fueled the exploration and settlement of entire continents. European explorers carried dried meat and dried biscuits across oceans. Without dehydration, oceanic exploration simply does not happen on the timescale it did. The nutritional mathematics of dried food are staggering. A pound of fresh fish might sustain one person for a meal. A pound of dried fish, with its water removed, carries concentrated protein and energy that could extend a voyage by days. When we talk about how Columbus reached the Americas or how Magellan's crew circled the globe, we are also talking about the dried and salted provisions that made those ships capable of leaving harbor. Salt and curing. Salt preservation changed the economic map of the ancient world more dramatically than almost any other single technology. Salt draws moisture out of food through osmosis, creating an environment too hostile for bacteria to survive. The Romans so valued salt for preserving meat and fish that they paid soldiers partly in salt, and yes, this is where the word salary comes from. Entire trade routes were built around salt deposits. Wars were fought over access to salt mines. The Hanseatic League, the powerful medieval trading alliance that dominated northern European commerce from the 13th to the 17th centuries, built much of its wealth on salted Baltic herring. This preserved fish became a staple protein across Europe, feeding populations through winters. When fresh food was impossible to come by, salt cod followed a similar trajectory, becoming a crucial commodity that connected European fishermen to Caribbean markets in ways that reshaped the Atlantic world. Fermentation. Fermentation might be the most misunderstood form of preservation in popular culture, because it sounds counterintuitive. You are allowing microorganisms to interact with your food. But the key is that fermentation encourages the right microorganisms, beneficial bacteria, yeasts, and molds, which outcompete the harmful ones. The byproducts of fermentation, typically acids or alcohol, create conditions where dangerous pathogens cannot survive. Beer and bread from fermented grain allowed ancient Egyptians to build the pyramids. Researchers have found evidence of industrial-scale beer production at pyramid construction sites. Workers consumed beer as a caloric supplement, a safer alternative to potentially contaminated water, and a means of preserving the nutrition of grain. Fermentation turned grain into liquid that was simultaneously food, medicine, and social currency. Sauerkraut and kimchi preserved vegetables through winter in Europe and Asia respectively. Captain James Cook famously brought sauerkraut on his voyages specifically to prevent scurvy, a vitamin C deficiency that had killed enormous numbers of sailors before him. Fermented food was literally saving lives at sea. Smoking combines multiple preservation mechanisms simultaneously. The heat kills surface bacteria. The smoke itself contains antimicrobial compounds including phenols and aldehydes. And the process naturally reduces moisture content, adding dehydration's benefits to the package. Smoked salmon, smoked meats, and smoked cheeses were not invented for flavor was a happy side effect. The original purpose was survival. Indigenous peoples of the Pacific Northwest developed sophisticated smoking techniques that preserved enormous salmon runs for consumption throughout the year. These preserved salmon stores supported dense, complex, non-agricultural societies with elaborate social hierarchies, rich artistic traditions, and sophisticated trade networks. The standard academic narrative ties civilization to agriculture, but the Pacific Northwest example proves that sufficient food preservation can generate civilizational complexity even without farming. Deep dive. The canning revolution and industrial scale. For most of human history, preservation methods were powerful but imperfect, and they required deep local knowledge to execute safely. The 19th century changed everything with the invention of canning. In 1809, French chef and confectioner Nicolas Appert discovered that sealing food in airtight glass containers and applying heat could preserve food indefinitely. Napoleon had offered a prize of 12,000 francs for a practical food preservation method to feed his armies, and Appert claimed it. Louis Pasteur would not explain the microbiology behind why this worked until decades later, but it worked regardless. Tin canning followed quickly, developed in Britain by Peter Durand in 1810. Suddenly, governments could feed armies in the field with unprecedented reliability. The American Civil War saw canned food become a staple of Union Army logistics, giving Northern forces a supply chain advantage that contributed meaningfully to the outcome of the conflict. By the late 19th and early 20th centuries, canning had transformed urban food supply. Cities could grow far beyond the agricultural capacity of their immediate surroundings because preserved food could be shipped from anywhere on the continent. Chicago became a meat-packing titan. California's canning industry sent preserved fruits and vegetables across America. The modern supermarket, that warehouse of shelf-stable goods, is the direct descendant of Nicolas Appert's glass jars. Analysis. The hidden social consequences. Food preservation did not just feed people. It reorganized society in ways we rarely pause to appreciate. Surplus storage meant that not everyone needed to produce food. When a community could store enough calories to feed non-farmers, it could afford to have specialists. Priests, soldiers, craftspeople, scribes, engineers. Every person who has ever held a specialized job owes that possibility to food preservation, creating the surplus that made their work possible. Preserved food also changed gender roles, seasonal rhythms, and the nature of warfare. Armies that could carry preserved rations moved faster and farther than those dependent on foraging. The ability to besiege a city for months, a critical military tactic throughout history, depended on besieging forces having preserved food supplies. Medieval castles were designed partly around massive food storage, because the side that could outlast a siege won. Preservation also introduced new forms of inequality. Those who controlled salt mines, those who owned smokehouses, those who could afford the fuel and labor for large-scale drying and curing operations, had power over those who could not.